what to do. His response: those who witnessed the Torah being torn were obligated to rend their garments, a Jewish expression of mourning. Those who actually tore the scroll, even though they were forced to do it at gunpoint, had to fast. But if they could not fast because of physical weakness due to hunger or other sufferings that they bore daily in the ghetto, one could not obligate them to fast. The second example involves a storeroom filled with clothing that once belonged to Jews who had been murdered. The question was, could the garments be used again? His response: since the garments had no bloodstains, they must have been removed before the victims were killed. Therefore, they could be worn, not only by the victims' heirs, but by others as well. He said, quote, the martyred souls would unquestionably derive spiritual satisfaction from the fact that their surviving captain brethren were garbed in garments that once belonged to them. The final question came from a 12-year-old boy who was devoted to the study of Torah. Recognizing that German actions were now a daily occurrence and that children were a main target, he asked if he might be permitted to observe the adult prayer ritual wearing tefillin, despite the fact that his bar mitzvah was 3 months away. Rabbi Oshry wrote, I ruled the precious child to merit the privilege of fulfilling this mitzvah. And then the rabbi himself posed a question. He asked, who could assure that the boy would live 3 months and reach the age of 13? Now, the nature of these questions, of those asking the questions, and the rabbi's responses, this epitomizes, for me, the ultimate in human dignity. They provide a glimpse of humanity struggling to stay alive in an ocean of inhumanity. We've all looked back on the Holocaust and asked, what would I have done? Rabbi Oshry and his followers offer an example of what I hope I could have done. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Penny Pritzker, United States Secretary of Commerce.
Good morning. Today we gather to remember the unspeakable event of the Holocaust, a horror that resulted in the murder of men, women, and children throughout Europe, including 6 million Jews and millions of Roma and others. 6 million is an impossible number to comprehend. We try to intellectualize the quantity, but we cannot begin to grasp the breadth of humanity behind that figure. And yet we must never forget. Every day of remembrance, we come together to try and remember the millions of lives, the sons and daughters, the mothers and fathers, the friends and neighbors who died in the Holocaust. For every number, a name, and behind every name, a story. Many of you here today have personal stories of the Holocaust. Through the lives you lead, you share these stories with your children, with your grandchildren, with students, with visitors to the Holocaust Museum. Through your stories, you ensure that those you lost are never forgotten. Through your words, you craft a living history that honors their memory. I say this so that we can reflect on the point that words have power. We humans have within us the capacity to create realities, good and evil, with speech and with our words. When a Holocaust survivor speaks about the death of a loved one who perished in the death camps or in the ghettos or in the killing fields, she creates a memorial in the minds of all who hear her story. The inverse is also true. When a Nazi poster placed in a town square says the Jews are defiler of the race, it strips the Jewish people of their humanity in the minds of all who see it. Yesterday's neighbors become today's enemy. The Holocaust is a lesson about the power of words and language. It is the most extreme example of what happens when we let our hate and fear of the other shape our speech. Years before the first concentration camp opened, and more than a decade before Kristallnacht, the Nazis began to pollute Europe with their speech and their language. They used hate speech to justify their eventual atrocities. This happens again and again throughout history. 5 decades before the Holocaust, my family fled Ukraine after the Russian pogroms. Tsar Alexander II had been assassinated 1 month earlier. Rumors spread that Jews were responsible, and riots erupted across Russia. My then 10-year-old great-grandfather hid in the attic with his father for more than 60 hours. When the violence had subsided, they discovered their grain store had been destroyed. Fearing for their safety, my entire family emigrated to Chicago later that year. The pogrom that drove my family out of Tsarist Russia was fueled in part by a leaflet distributed by the Southern Russian Workers' Union. The leaflet said, "One should not beat the Jew because he's a Jew and prays to God in his own way. Rather, one should beat him because he is robbing the people. He is sucking the blood of the working man." Imagine my great-grandfather's horror when he traveled to Berlin in 1934, more than 50 years later, and saw the same bigoted speech spreading across Germany. At the time he wrote, and I quote, "Nazi Germany is merely history repeating itself, the case of the few being used as scapegoats." My great-grandfather visited Berlin at almost the exact time that the Nazi hate speech was beginning to translate into state-implemented marginalization of the Jews. If there was ever a time for the German people to stand up against the bigotry of their government, 1934 was it. And yet most Germans stood idly by and watched the Nuremberg race laws were implemented, effectively purging Jews from German society. Speech creates realities, good and evil, and hate speech has a friend in silence. Most Germans did not murder Jews or Roma, but every person who knew what was happening in the death camps and chose to go about their lives was complicit with the atrocities. My dear friend Rabbi Yehiel Pupko calls them the tribe of the folded arms, and they bear their share of guilt. Silence is dangerous because it spreads the notion that the problems of your neighbor are not your problems. We are all familiar with Martin Niemöller's litany, First, they came for the socialists. To this day, many use his words to illustrate that you cannot tolerate discrimination against others, because one day hate will come knocking on your door. But this litany also underscores the important point that institutional discrimination is gradual. First, they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, later the Jews. First, you lost your job if you spoke out. Later, you lost your job just for being Jewish. First, you were moved from your home into the ghetto. And later, years later, you were sent in cattle cars to Auschwitz. Societies do not move from good to evil overnight. The challenge of the gradual descent into hate is to speak out early enough and loud enough to reverse its course. Today in our beloved United States, we are witnessing a rising fear of the other. The Southern Poverty Law Center recently surveyed teachers across the country about how the rhetoric of this election is affecting their students. More than 2/3 reported that their students, mainly immigrants, children of immigrants, and Muslims, are worried about what might happen to them after the election. More than 1/3 are seeing more anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant sentiment in their classrooms. Let me be clear. I do not think a Holocaust is possible in America. But I worry about what happens when we betray the principles of inclusion that form the foundation of our country. Freedom of speech gives us the right to speak our mind. It is a precious right, but it does not free us from the responsibility of the consequences of our words. This right should not be used to dehumanize others with language. As Americans, we have a choice. Do we give in to the language of fear? Do we sit with our arms folded while words are used to dehumanize other fellow human beings? Or do we stand up and speak out? During my great-grandfather's trip to Berlin in 1934, he and my Uncle Jay were eating lunch one day when a group of Nazi supporters, headed by a band, entered the cafe. Tables were pushed together, fiery speeches were made. Eventually, one speaker called for a toast to Hitler. Everyone in the restaurant stood up and gave the salute. Looking at Jay, my great-grandfather said, "What do we do now? Do we rise?" Jay, who was only 14 years old at the time, said, "Grandpa, are we cowards? Then we do not rise nor salute." If my uncle, a teenager visiting a foreign country where the sidewalks are covered in posters proclaiming his people a menace to humanity, had the courage to stick to his principles, what is the excuse for our silence? My great-grandfather and uncle made silence their dissent at a time when drawing attention to their faith and beliefs was not just unwise, but dangerous. Their silence was powerful. It was justified. Ours is not. All of us live in a country built on the ideals of inclusion and tolerance. We are a country that celebrates the dignity of difference. We are better than the language of hate. America is not the tribe of folded arms. If one of the lessons of the Holocaust is that thou shalt not be silent, then today, on this day of remembrance, We must honor the memories of the millions who were murdered by speaking up against hate speech we encounter in our lives and in our country. The Torah teaches us that you must not go around slandering your fellow human beings. You must not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is at stake. Our neighbors' lives, their dignity, their humanity are at stake, and we cannot stand idly by. Never forget that life and death are in the hands of speech. And may we never forget the stories of the millions singled out for annihilation: the Jewish people, the Roma, and sons and daughters all across Europe by the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Holt, Vice Chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council.
Good morning. Secretary Pritzker, thank you for your wonderful comments this morning. As Jewish families around the world recently celebrated Passover, they recalled deliverance from slavery and newfound freedom. For families like mine, Passover has added meaning because the very notions of freedom and family carry extra significance when all of one's grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. Thankfully, my parents, like the Jews fleeing Egypt, were eventually liberated. Born in separate towns in Poland, their combined Holocaust experience reads like a catalog of the most infamous places: the Lodz Ghetto, Dachau, Gross Rosen, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz. After managing to survive by their wits and sheer luck, my parents met serendipitously during the chaotic moments when they were liberated by American troops, and survive they did as they just celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary. When I see the flags behind me representing the U.S. Army divisions that liberated the camps, I know that I stand here today only because of the courage and sacrifice of one of those divisions. And to the World War II veterans here today, I want you to know that there are no words to express the gift you gave to my parents. You gave them not only freedom, you gave them hope. America always was and remains for them a beacon of hope. And it was that hope that was so crucial as they struggled to rebuild their shattered lives. The resilience of the survivors is truly remarkable. But most remarkable of all is that although they were subjected to the most inhumane treatment, they never lost their humanity. Although the world abandoned them, they never abandoned the world. They could have responded to hate with more hate, to violence with more violence. They did not. Despite being tested in ways the rest of us find unimaginable, they retained their compassion and dignity. That should be a source of inspiration and hope to all of us. Yet today, as we honor the survivors and celebrate their extraordinary resilience, we must never forget that forces that made them victims in the first place, dangerous forces that are resurgent today, anti-Semitism, hate, extremism. So, as we light these memorial candles and think about those who were killed, We must never forget why they were killed and that their killing was preventable. That is the challenge to each of us, the challenge of Holocaust memory. We will be assisted in the candle lighting ceremony by Milgros de Souza, a junior at Eastern High School and a graduate of the museum's Youth Leadership Program. Inspired by her parents, who are both graduates of the program, Milagros hopes to become a role model and leader among youth in her community. I would now like to ask Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland to stand by the first candle. The first candle will be lit by Anna Seelfreund Gross of Russia, Romania, and Theodora Kleiman of Zagreb, Yugoslavia. As a teenager, Anna was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where her mother and two of her sisters were murdered. She survived forced labor before liberation in 1945. After Theodora's parents were sent to concentration camps, she and her brother were hidden throughout the war by their non-Jewish uncle and other neighbors. Both Anna and Theodora are museum volunteers today. The second candle will be lit by Joseph Gringlas. Born in Ostrowiec, Poland, he survived incarceration in several labor and concentration camps, including Auschwitz, as well as a death march. He was liberated by American troops from the slave labor camp Dora Mittelbau, where Germans were manufacturing V2 rockets. Be lit by Kurt Gutfried of Vienna. Following the deportation and murder of his father and grandfather, 5-year-old Kurt and his mother were deported to Theresienstadt, where they survived until liberation. Thank you, Senator Cardin. I would now like to ask Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia to stand by the fourth candle. The fourth candle will be lit by Shoshana Rose Reichbach of Mizra, Poland. Following Germany's invasion of Poland, Shoshana's father smuggled the family to Belarus, where they were deported to a gulag in Siberia by the Soviets. The family later relocated to Kyrgyzstan, where they remained until the end of the war. The fifth candle will be lit lit by Leo Ullman, born in Amsterdam. With the assistance of the Dutch resistance, 3-year-old Leo was hidden with a couple in Amsterdam while his parents were able to find shelter in an attic elsewhere in the city. They had no contact until they reunited in 1945. The sixth candle will be lit by Alfred and Josiane Traum. 10-year-old Alfred, born in Vienna, was sent by his parents on a kinder transport to England, where he was welcomed by a host family. Alfred later served in the British and Israeli armies. Josiane was born in Brussels. Her mother, a member of the Belgian resistance, hid her first in a convent and later with a Christian family. Alfred and Josiane volunteer at the museum along with Mrs. Traum's mother, a survivor of Auschwitz. Thank you, Congressman Beyer, and thank you to all of the survivors here today. Your sacrifices, courage, despite unimaginable suffering, must never be forgotten. Thank you.
El Male Rachamim, Prayer for the Dead, will be chanted by Chazan Enrique Ozur Bass, followed by Gideon Frieder, a Holocaust survivor from Zvolen, Slovakia, will lead us in reciting Kaddish.
Malerachamim Shochein Baromim Amtze Menuchan mechona tachat kanfei השכינה במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים חללי השואה באירופה שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו ושנשרפו על קידוש השם בידי המרצחים הנאצים יימח שמם ועוזריהם משאר עמים באושוויץ, טרבלינקה, מיידנק, מאטהוזן, ברגן-בלזן, סוביבור ובשאר מחנות השמדה שהלכו לעולמם, ובעבור שכל הקהל מתפלל לעילוי נשמותיהם, לכם בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם בגן עדן מנוחתם, ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימים, ונאמר אמן.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהא שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעולמה, ואמרו אמן. יהא שלמה רבה מן שמיה עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Please remain standing for the singing of the Hymn of the Partisans, led by Chazan Bass, and the retirement of the flags.
Sag mit kein Mal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Himmeln Leiene verstellen bläue Tag, kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, es wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir seinen da, kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, es wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir seinen da. Never say this is the final road for you. The leaden skies make over days of blue, as the hour that we longed for is so near. Our steps beat out the message, we are here, as the hours that we longed for is so near. Our step beats out the message, we are here. Al nat tomarin et darki achrona, et or hayom istiru shmei hanana, zayom nichsafnu lod yaveh yavo, umitzadeinu ad yarim anachnu po, zayom nichsafnu lod yaveh yavo, umitzadeinu ad yarim anachnu po.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our program. Thank you for sharing our commitment to Holocaust remembrance.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Friday morning, Jim Tankersley, Washington Post economic correspondent, and Pew Charitable Trust's Financial Security and Mobility Director, Aaron Currier. They join us to talk about the fiscal challenges facing middle-class Americans. They'll analyze salaries, job security, economic mobility, and savings practices. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal beginning live at 7 a.m. Eastern Friday morning. Join the discussion. On Friday, a discussion about how ISIS is using the internet and social media to recruit supporters. The Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee hosts the event, looking at efforts to combat ISIS online. You can watch that live at noon Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
In both Iraq and Afghanistan, I helped both countries with their constitutions, being sort of a facilitator of agreement on key issues among Iraqis or Afghans. Your influence is considerable. The heads of state or government are very anxious to meet with you when you ask for a meeting.
Sunday night on Q&A, former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, and the United Nations, Zalmay Khalilzad, discusses his memoir, The Envoy, From Kabul to the White House, My Journey Through a Turbulent World.
We saw that the extremists such as Zarqawi exploited, although we've then corrected it towards the end of the period that I was there by the surge, by reaching out to the Sunnis, by building up Iraqi forces, by establishing a unity government, killing Zarqawi at the end to bring about security. Violence was way down, but unfortunately when we left and the vacuum was filled by rival regional powers pulling Iraq apart, violence escalated and we have ISIS now.
Sunday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
Next, a discussion about global anti-Semitism, hosted by Indiana University. The keynote address was delivered by Erwin Kotler, a former Canadian Attorney General and founder of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. This is an hour and 10 minutes.
As one of only 2 research institutes in the nation dedicated to the exploration of anti-Semitism in modern contexts, the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism is a source of great pride for Indiana University. Moreover, the Institute has made invaluable contributions to the Bloomington community by bringing leading scholars and activists to campus from all parts of the globe to share their experiences, expertise, and perspectives. This week's conference alone has brought some 70 scholars from 16 different countries to our campus. And this is the 3rd such international conference sponsored by the Institute in the past 5 years. In short, the efforts of Professor Rosenfeld and all those who work with the Institute have established IU Bloomington as a worldwide hub for the study of anti-Semitism, and equally as important, a hub for a global community of individuals dedicated to the enduring power of diversity and inclusion. This evening, I am delighted to continue this tradition by welcoming back to our campus the Honorable Erwin Kotler to deliver our keynote address. Erwin Kotler is the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, as well as Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University. He has served various roles in the Canadian government, including as a Member of Parliament, Minister of Justice, and Attorney General. Professor Kotler's career has been defined by an abiding commitment to human rights and equality in all its forms. This commitment has been evident in everything from his efforts to make the Canadian Supreme Court the most gender representative in the world, to his leadership of the Canadian delegation to the Stockholm Conference on the Prevention and Combating of Genocide. Furthermore, Professor Kotler has distinguished himself as an international human rights lawyer, serving as counsel to prisoners of conscience who include such notable figures as Nelson Mandela, Jacobo Timerman in Argentina, Professor Said Eden Ibrahim, a great friend of Indiana University in Egypt, and Andrei Sakharov and Nathan Sharansky. Sharansky, a former lecturer in this very series in the former Soviet Union. He has testified as an expert witness on human rights in governmental assemblies around the world, including the United States, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and Israel. Professor Kotler's advocacy for human rights in all corners of the globe reminds us of the powerful words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Most recently, Professor Kotler's lifelong commitment to human rights led to the creation of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, named after the Swedish diplomat who saved thousands of Hungarian Jews from the Nazis during World War II, only to tragically disappear after being captured by Soviet forces in 1945. As you might expect from Professor Kotler's leadership, the center has a distinctly international scope in its advocacy for human rights, focusing on issues of pressing contemporary importance, such as human rights in Iran. In February, his work on behalf of the center brought him to the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, and we're so pleased that his work now brings him back to Indiana University Bloomington. Please join me in welcoming Professor Erwin Kotler.
Thank you for really that warm and very heartwarming introduction. When I come to Indiana amongst such a community of scholars, I feel very much at home, and I have to say that I'm particularly moved to participate in the Simona and Hart Haston Visiting Scholars program, because as I mentioned to both of them just before coming in here, they have been heroes of my wife. My wife was a parliamentary secretary to the Likud, but very close to the former Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, shared a close friendship with the Hastons. So for me, this is a unexpected connection, but a very, very welcome one on a personal as well as a scholarly basis. I want to as well join in the tribute to Professor Alvin Rosenfeld. I want to say that he is a model of moral and intellectual leadership. He has made of this conference, this gathering of international scholars, the preeminent gathering of its kind internationally. And he has made of the Institute for the Contemporary Study of Anti-Semitism a preeminent institute in that regard. Also, his work reminds me of something, and if you'll pardon me, a personal reference here. I know that the introduction, and you could not have mentioned the one thing in that introduction that's always missing, and understandably so, and that is the debt that I owe to my parents of blessed memory. And the reason for that is that it was my father who taught me when I was a young boy, before I understood the profundity of his remarks, when he would say to me repeatedly that tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, as he put it, is equal to all the other commandments combined. This, as he put it, you must teach unto your children. But it was my mother who, when she would hear my father saying this, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice remains a theoretical abstraction. And I suspect that as a result of these teachings, I got involved in the two great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century, the struggle for human rights and Soviet Jewry in the former Soviet Union, and the struggle against apartheid, and with the political prisoners who became the face, the identity, the vision of those struggles, Anatoly Sharansky, as he then was in the former Soviet Union, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. But the reason I'm mentioning this and I'm connecting it to Alvin is because his work with respect to the scholarly inquiry and the moral intellectual leadership that he is providing is really not just the struggle against anti-Semitism, but in the larger sense of the word, the struggle against injustice. That is what brings us together. That is what my mother would have liked to have seen us do as part of my father's call for justice, but my mother's warning about pursuing justice by combating injustice. And that is what we are doing in convening as we are today. And so I'm pleased to share with you this evening some thoughts, some concerns, some reflections, and yes, even some hope. Somebody said to me, am I going to be adding to some of that brooding omnipresence that we have been hearing about, the shadows of anti-Semitism, the dangers, the threats, the terror, and the like. But I want to say that I'm also hoping to end on a hopeful ending, and I'm encouraged by the fact that we do have these gatherings of scholars coming together. So our struggle then is not an atomized struggle in silos, but we can come together in common cause here and beyond. So it's in that context that I want to share these remarks with you this evening about the Jewish condition and the human condition, about assaults on Jews and assaults on human rights, about the state of Jews in the world today and the state of the world inhabited by Jews, about anti-Semitism as being not only the oldest and most enduring of hatreds. I would say the paradigm of radical hatred, as the Holocaust is the paradigm of radical evil, but the most toxic, the most lethal, as our late and great colleague Robert Wistrich put it in his magisterial work, a lethal obsession. And as it happens, we meet at an important historical moment of remembrance and reminder. We are meeting on the 80th anniversary of the coming into effect of the Nuremberg race laws, which ended up being prologue and precursor to taking us down the road to the Holocaust. We meet also on the 71st anniversary year of the liberation of Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, a reminder of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. 1.3 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not itself die at Auschwitz. And Jews and the related anti-Semitism have emerged and have emerged for some time as what I would call the bloodied canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And as we've learned only too well and too tragically, that while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so the underlying thesis of my remarks this evening, and I regret that I've been repeating this thesis for some time now, but it just intensifies, is that we are witnessing a new, global, escalating, sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, which received its first international, institutional, juridical expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism resolution, whose 40th anniversary we recently commemorated, but has gone dramatically beyond that. That which the then U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Moynihan, said about it, that it gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. But as I said, it has gone dramatically beyond that. A new anti-Semitism which needs almost a new vocabulary to define it, but which can best be defined or find expression in a set of metrics that are anchored in human rights and international law in general and equality rights and equality law in particular. In other words, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in any society that they inhabit. And we have developed metrics to identify and evaluate this traditional or classical anti-Semitism. And the Anti-Defamation League, in a global comparative study in 2014, using some 11 of these, what I would call traditional metrics, such questions as do Jews have too much power, control the media, kill, etc., determined at the end of that global study that anti-Semitism, as they put it, was a persistent and pervasive virus. But I want to suggest to you that there is this new anti-Semitism with a set of metrics that were not even included in the Anti-Defamation League, and which I want to share with you this evening. But first, if I may, to excerpt from a speech that Per Allmark gave some 16 years ago at the beginning of the 21st century, when, in observing the developments in the old and new anti-Semitism and the intersection between the two, stated in a rather pithy and prescient way a process and connection and intersectionality, if you wish, in that sense, which underpins my remarks this evening. When he said, and I quote, "Compared to most previous anti-Jewish outbreaks, this new anti-Semitism is often less directed against individual Jews. It primarily targets the collective Jews, the state of Israel." I just might add parenthetically that Per Allmark was a former deputy prime minister of Sweden, who emerged as one of the leading scholars with respect to old and new anti-Semitism. And then he continues, "And then such attacks start a chain reaction of assaults on individual Jews and Jewish institutions." And he concludes, "In the past, the most dangerous anti-Semites were those who wanted to make the world Judenrein, free of Jews. Today, the most dangerous anti-Semites might be those who want to make the world Judenstaatrein, free of a Jewish state." And in that context, I want to summarize some 5 metrics of the new anti-Semitism. I've elsewhere outlined some 12 metrics, but I don't want to unduly bore and burden you, so I will seek to limit it to 5. Even then you might say this is somewhat burdening. But the 5 that I want to discuss this evening are: 1, genocidal anti-Semitism; 2, demonological anti-Semitism; 3, political anti-Semitism; 4, anti-Jewish terror; and finally, and the one that I think is the most sophisticated and therefore maybe the most dangerous in that sense, because the others at least are overt and public and clear, is what I would call the laundering or masking of anti-Semitism under universal public values, under all the things that people care about in their common humanity. I hope then, and if time permits, to not leave it in an analytical framework, but to suggest some initiatives that we may take as a group of scholars to both not only better understand, but to better address and redress this new anti-Semitism. Let me begin with the first metric of the new anti-Semitism, what I would call genocidal anti-Semitism. This is not a term that I use lightly or easily. It is a term that I'm taking right out of the Genocide Convention's prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in a major case in the matter of upholding the constitutionality of our anti-hate legislation in Canada, when the court said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. And in a more recent judgment, Muga Serra case, where a Rwandan had come to Canada in 1992 and sought refugee status in Canada. I won't go through the levels of proceedings and hearings, but at the end of the day, the court ordered his extradition back to Rwanda. He had said, "How can I, on the grounds of incitement to genocide?" And his argument was, "I came to Canada in 1992. I was actually seeking refugee status." The genocide in Rwanda